Hello students, I am Raghavendra Kumar Singh, faculty of US Academy and Institute. Today we will discuss class 10th History's 4th chapter, The Age of Industrialization. In this chapter we will discuss about the history of Britain, the first industrial nation, and then India, where the pattern of industrial change was conditioned by colonial rule. In this chapter, we will explain the scenario before the industrial evolution and how it changes over time in terms of labor, setting up of factories, etc. Some of the other topics should also be explained or discussed are industrialization in the colonies, industrial growth, market for goods, workers' life, etc. Industrialization is an association of craftsmen or merchants following same craft to protect the members interested and supervise the standard of the work, such as tanning, food processing, Victorian Britain, bravery, vagrant, Burgills, Gomesta, staplers. In this, the tanning convert raw hide into leather by soaking in liquid containing tannic acid. While in the food processing, techniques of chopping and mixing food for making juice, jams, etc. Victorian Britain during the reign of Queen Victoria. Brewery, a place where beer, etc., is brewed commercially. Brewing is a process of infusion, boiling, and fermentation, whereas vagrant, a people without a settled home or regular work. Gomasta, an Indian word meaning an agent, a middleman between the merchant and the weavers. While in stapler, a person who staples or sorts wool according to its fibers. Now about industrialization. What is industrialization? Industrialization means the production of goods with the help of machines in factories. The first industrialized nation is Britain. The features of the industrialization is handmade goods to machine, made goods in factories, cottage to factories, a large scale production started in England in later part of 18th century. In course of time it affected all systems of production. Now about the before industrial revolution. Production in 17th century, artisans worked for merchants to produce goods. Artisans took raw materials from merchants for production. Their cottages functioned as a factory. Association of producers trained craft people maintained control over production, restricted entry of new traders. This saw that the coming of factories. Proto-industrialization is referred to the phase which existed even before factories began in England and Europe. There are large-scale industries production for an international market, not based on factories. In the 17th century and 18th century, merchants from Europe moved to the countryside, supplying money to peasants and artisans, requesting them to produce for an international market. Merchants were restricted to expand their productions within the towns because rulers granted different guilds the monopoly right to produce and trade in specific products. In the countryside, poor peasants and artisans eagerly agreed so that they could remain in the countryside and continue to cultivate their small plots. The proto-industrial system was thus part of a network of commercial exchange controlled by merchant. Now about the coming up of the factory. Early factories in England came up by the 1730s. First symbol of a new era is cotton mill. Many factories sprang up in England. A series of inventions took place in the form of carding, twisting, spinning, and rolling. In the 1730s, the earliest factories in England were set up, but only in the late 18th century the number of factories multiplied. Cotton was the first symbol for the new era, and its production boomed into the late 19th century. Richard Arkwright created the cotton mill, where costly machines were set up, and all the processes were brought together under one roof and management. Now, the place of industrial change. First, in Britain, the most dynamic industries were cotton and metals. Cotton was the leading sector in the first phase of industrialization up to 1840, followed by iron and steel industries. Second, the new industries found it difficult to place traditional industries. The pace of change in the traditional industries was not set by steam powered cotton or metal industries, but they did not remain entirely stagnant either. The technological changes occurred slowly. James Watt improved the steam engine produced by Newcomen and patented the new engine in 1781. His industrialist friend Matthew Boulton manufactured the new model. Steam engines were not used in any of the other industries until much later in the centuries. Cotton and iron and steel industries were the most dynamic industries in this time. New industries could not displace traditional ones. Technological changes occurred slowly. New technologies were slow to be accepted, and the steam engine invented by James Watt had no buyer for the years. Whereas the next topic is hand labor and steam power. There was no shortage of human labor in Victorian Britain. Industrialists had no problems of labor shortage or high wage costs. Instead of machine, industrialists required large capital investment. The demand for labor was seasonal in many industries. In all such industries where production fluctuated with the season, industrialists usually preferred hand labor, employing workers for the season. In many industries, the demand for laborers was seasonal. A range of product could be produced only with hand laborers. There was a demand for intricate design. Upper classes preferred things produced by hands. In Victorian Britain, there was no shortage of human labor. Now, life of the workers. The life of the workers were affected by the abundance of labor in the market. To get a job, Workers should have existing network of friendship and keen relationship in a factory. Till the mid 19th century, it was difficult for workers to find jobs. In the early 19th century, wages were increased. The fear of unemployment made workers hostile to the introduction of new technology. Spinning jenny was introduced in the modern woolly industries. After the 1840s, building activities intensified in the cities, opening up greater opportunities for employment. Roads were widened, new railway stations came up. Railway lines were extended, tunnels dug, drainage and sewers led, rivers and embankment. Abundance of the labor affected the life of the workers badly. Labors were seasonal. Fear of unemployment made workers hostile to new technology. Women laborers protested against the introduction of the spinning jenny. Introduction of railways opened greater opportunities. Now about the industrialization in the colonies. Textile industries were the center of industrialization in India. The age of Indian textiles in India, silk and cotton goods dominated the international market in textiles. Before the age of machine industries, a variety of Indian merchants and bankers were involved in this network of export trade, financing production, carrying goods and supplying exporters. By the 1750s, this network controlled by Indian merchants were breaking down. The European companies came into power, first securing a variety of concessions from local court, then the monopoly right to trade. The shift from the old port to the new ones was an indicator of the growth of colonial power. European companies controlled trade through the new port and were carried in new ships. Many old trading houses collapsed, and those who wanted to survive had to operate within a network shaped by European trading companies. Finer variety of cotton from India were exported. A vibrant sea trade operated through pre-colonial ports. Now, what happened to weavers? After the 1760s, the consolidation of the East India Company did not initially lead to a decline in textile export from India. Before establishing political power in Bengal and Carnatic in the 1760s and 1770s, the East India Company had found it difficult to ensure a regular supply of goods for export. After the East India Company established political power, it developed a system of management and control that would eliminate competition, control costs, and ensure regular supplies of cotton and silk goods. It was established by following a series of steps: by eliminating existing traders and brokers connected with the cloth trade and establishing more direct control over the weavers, by preventing companies weavers from dealing with the buyers. The weavers were granted a loan to buy the raw materials. Once an order and were placed, weavers who took loans needed to hand over the cloth they produced to the gomasta. Weaving required the labors of the entire family, with children and women all engaged in different stages of the process. Earlier, supply merchants had a very close relationship with weavers, but new gomastas were outsiders with no social link with the villages. In many places in Carnatic and Bengal, weavers set up looms in other villages where they had some family relation. In other places, weavers along with the village traders revolt, opposing the company and its officials. Over time, many weavers began refusing loans, closing down their workshops and taking to agricultural labor. By the turn of the 19th century, cotton weavers faced a new set of problems. Now, Manchester comes to India. In 1772, Henry Petullo said that the demand for Indian textile could never reduce, since no other nation produced goods of the same quality. But unfortunately, by the opening of the 19th century, India witnessed a decline in textile exports. In the early 19th century, exports of British cotton goods increased dramatically. At the end of the 18th century, imports of cotton piece goods were restricted into India. In India, cotton weavers faced two problems. Number one, their export market collapsed, local market shrank and glutted with the Manchester export. By the 1860s, weavers faced new problems. They could not sufficient supply of raw cottons of good quality. Even the raw cotton export from India increased, due to which the price increased. By the end of the 19th century, other craft peoples faced yet another problem. Factories in India began production, flooding the market with machine goods. The aim of the East India Company behind appointing Gomasters was to work out a system of management and control that would eliminate competition, control cost, and ensure regular supplies of cotton and silk. They did not allow the company's weaver to sell the products to other buyers. Once an order was placed, the weavers were given loans. Factories come up. In 1854, the first cotton mill in Bombay set up and went into production 2 years later. By 1862, four more mills were set up, and around the same time, jute mills came up in Bengal. The first jute mill was set up in 1855, and another one after 7 years in 1862. In the 1860, in North India, the Elgin mill was started in Kanpur, and a year later the first cotton mill of Ahmedabad was set up. By 1874, the first spinning and weaving mill of Madras began production. The early entrepreneur. The history of trade, starting from the late 18th century, when British in India began exporting opium to China and took tea from China to England. Some of the businessmen who were involved in these type of traders had a vision of developing enterprises in India. In Bengal, Dwarkanath Tagore made his fortune in the China trade. In Bombay, Parsis like Dinsopatit and Jamshedji Nesarwanji Tata built huge industries empire in India. Seth Hukum Chand, a Marwadi businessman, set up the first Indian jute mill in Kolkata in 1917. The opportunities of investment in industries opened up, and many of them set up factories. But due to the colonial power, Indians were barred from trading with Europe. In manufacturing, goods and had to export mostly raw materials and food grains, just like the raw cotton, opium, wheat, and indigo. Required by the British, three of the biggest European managing agencies are Bird Hagler and Corporation, Andrew Yule, and Jordan Skinner and Company, who mobilized capital, set up joint stock companies, and managed them. Now, where did the workers come from? As the factories started expanding, the demand for workers increased. Most of the workers came from the neighboring district in search of work. Over 50% workers in the Bombay cotton industries in 1911 came from the neighboring district of Ratnagiri, while the mills of Kanpur cotton mill offered their textile hands from the villages within the district of Kanpur. As the news of employment spread, workers travelled great distance in the hope of work in the mill. Even after the demand for workers increased, getting jobs were difficult. The numbers seeking work were always more than the jobs available. Most of the industrialists employed a jobbers, which he brought from his village to recruit new workers. Industrialists helped the jobbers to settle down and provide them with money in need. Now, the peculiarities of industrial growth. European managing agencies were interested in certain kinds of products such as tea and coffee. They established tea and coffee plantation and invested in mining indigo and jute. These products were used only for export purposes. In the late 19th century, Indian businessmen began setting up industries. The yarn produced in Indian spinning mills was used by handlooms, weavers in India or exported to China. The pattern of industrialization was affected by a series of changes. When the Swadeshi movement gained support, nationalists boycotted foreign clothes. From 1906, Indian yarn export to China declined, since produce from Chinese and Japanese mills flooded the Chinese market. Till the end of the First World War, industrial growth was slow. The war completed changes the whole scenario, and Indian mills took advantage of the situation. They had a vast market to supply war needs: jute bags, clothes for army uniforms, tents, and leather boots, horse and mule saddles, and a host of other items. The industrial production boomed over the years, and after the war, Manchester would never recaptured its old position in the Indian market. Now, the small scale industries predominate. Small scale industries continues to predominate the rest of the countries. Only a small proportion of the total industrial laborers force worked in registered factories. The rest worked in small workshop and household units. Handicraft production expanded in the 20th century. In the 20th century, handloom clothes production expanded. It's happened because of technological changes, as they started adopting new technologies which helped them improve production without excessively pushing up costs. Certain group of weavers were in a better position than others to survive. The competition with mill industries, some of the weavers produced coarse cloth while others wove finer varieties. Weavers and other craft peoples who continued to expand production through the 20th century did not necessarily prosper. They worked for long hours, including all the women and children, but they were not simply remnant of past times. In the age of factories. Their life and labors were integral to the process of industrialization. Now, market for goods. When new products were produced, advertisement helped people to make market appear desirable and necessary. They tried to shape the minds of peoples and create new needs. Today, we are surrounded by advertisement which appears in newspaper, magazine, hoardings, street walls, television screens, etc. From the very beginning of the industry's age, advertisement plays a part in expanding the market for products and in shaping new consumer culture. Manchester Industries put label on the cloth bundles to mark the quality. When buyers saw "Made in Manchester" written in bold on the label, they were expected to feel confident about buying the clothes. Some of the labels were made with images and were beautifully crafted. Images of Indian gods and goddesses appears on these labels. Printing calendars were started by manufacturers to popularize their products. In these calendars, figures of gods were used to sell new products. Later, advertisement became a vehicle of the nationalist message of Swadeshi. Now the conclusion. The age of industries has meant major technological changes, growth of factories, and the making of a new industrial labor force. Hand technologies and small-scale production remain an important part of the industrial landscape.